Hey everybody, it's Ashley with my 7th video for the reading artifacts, and for this one I was going to talk about becoming visible lessons in disability, which is from the disability and teaching in the teaching of writing textbook that we have, chapter 11, in case you guys weren't sure. Anyhow, there's several different things that I really appreciated about this particular text, and the first one doesn't have to do so much with mayors, which is predominantly what they discuss, but it has to do with a quote that I found on page 142, where the writers say teacher research is not designed to investigate cause and effect. Instead, it aims to describe as fully as possible what happened in one teaching situation. And that quote is also from someone called, last name McNeely. I didn't look up the rest of the name. In any case, in doing the research for the inquiry project and looking at how, kind of like just how they structure these research articles, the studies that they do, they present it in a certain way that when you look at, some of the other, more statistical data type, statistical driven type research is, they kind of look similar, but the focus that I've found in many of the articles that I've read is more on teacher experience, which I think is, really quite great, to be honest, because, they're situating it in a way that shows how, that values experience and not just, necessarily, the numbers. It's not something that's necessary. Not everything in academia is quantifiable. Anyhow, so not only that is, I'm also coming out of from last semester feminist theory class, and even doing a piece for the symposium on it. It reminds me of how like second wave feminists talked about the political being personal, and so in this instance they're using education or their experience. They're making education personal because it is very personal. I mean, you're expecting students to expand their thought processes, and you are really kind of shaping part of their lives for a short time, if all goes well. But and so instead of just, like I said, focus, like some of these studies focusing on the how would you put it, like that quantifiable data, the assessments and all this other stuff, they're actually just focusing on the experience that they have with one particular situation, and they're showing how that experience is indicative of other things that are, like I said, you can't always quantify how a student grows, as a person in this instance, and in other ways as well. So that's why portfolios are really good. It's kind of better to see it that way. Okay, that's a tangent. Anyhow, so that quote, I really appreciated it, like I said, because in doing the research and and thinking about my inquiry project, because I do pull from a lot of my personal experience, and just speaking with other people, it really helps. It kind of helped me feel a little bit better about using personal experience, because I feel like we don't always get to do that. Anyhow, so the next part was really just about mayors, and the quote on 144, where they say the author challenged us to see ourselves beyond the packaged image that our culture sells us, and that is in the second full paragraph on that page, if you're looking for it. And I thought that in reading about like the reactions of the students, which I'll kind of get more into the next video that I'm going to be doing, but in thinking about that, I just thought it was amazing that a text in a classroom is something that can change our outlook on many things. Something that I experienced even as like a high school and middle school teacher. When I was, excuse the background noises from very noisy undergraduate students and neighbors. Anyhow, but as a high school and middle school teacher, I was able to implement a reading program that was based on, oh no, and I forgot her name. I will put that in the notes later. That way you guys can look it up. Anyhow, but what it did was it set out a program where students were required to read 40 books in a school year, which is pretty much like one book a week. But the thing is that they could choose whatever book they wanted to read. They could reread books. You know, there was a lot of leeway in the system. And the hope is to help students cultivate a love of reading, which in turn really typically cultivates a love of learning as well. And, you know, the idea is that we need to read more frequently so that we become better readers, which helps us, of course, in the long run with everything. And anyhow, and so when, as a personal experience of mine, I was able to see how that actually helped students, you know, change their outlook on not only learning but reading. You know, I had people or some of my students accused me of making them love to read. How dare you make me pick up a book rather than watch a TV show, which I thought was hilarious. But in either sense, that reminded me of what I'm reading here, where they say that the author challenged us to see ourselves beyond the packaged image of our culture, what our culture sells us. And so it's great to see how something that we write, or in this case Mayors wrote, can really alter our outlooks and how we perceive things, and broaden our minds a lot more. And so I thought that was really, really quite cool, and pretty much the reason why I am a teacher. So anyhow, all right, so the next video I'll be doing follows this. It was the piece that I could choose to read anything from this textbook, and so I will get into that now. I'm just going to make a whole video, one thing, that because they are related. What I chose to read was actually Mayer's piece that is in chapter 26, and it's called Sex and Death and the Crippled Body, a Meditation. And so, you know, when I read that piece, I thought the piece that Becoming Visible, I believe, Becoming Visible. My brain left me for a moment. I wanted to read that. I wanted to read that piece that caused the male students in her class to have such a reaction against against this idea of what a woman's body is and what it does, what happens to it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Typically the latter two. And so when I read it, it was what I really appreciated about it. And I don't know that I really have any specific quote or anything that kind of stood out to me other than the discussion about sex. But what I really just appreciated about it was that it was so personal, and it was so raw in many ways, being able to talk about things that, you discuss with your doctor and your mom, just that small thing about wanting to have sex with your husband and people dismissing it is at once are you serious? And then also, well, I was not surprised, not just because, Nancy Mayers has MS, but because it's kind of, it's what I think that a lot of people think about sex once you become a certain age. They're just thinking, oh, well, you're done with that. Well, no, not necessarily. And especially not necessarily because, people typically think that people with disabilities don't have those desires, which is, insane. I was listening to a podcast, I think it was maybe last semester, and of course, it is leaving my brain at the moment. I'm trying to remember if I can think of it right now, but I can't. Again, I'll put it in the notes. But what this podcast talks about is a lot of things that are more futuristic, like near future, as far as like what technologies are coming up and things like that. And one of those things was about coding and programming and developing new products and things like that. And it was kind of like a contest or like a hackathon or something along those lines, where people had to produce this product. And a lot of them, from what I understood, came up with things that would help people who are disabled to be able to have, sexual relationships and things like that, and to be able to have that sort of pleasure. And so when I was reading that, I was recalling that particular podcast, and just kind of how, to be honest, until I heard that podcast, I didn't even think about things like that, which is, because that's not really my lived experience. And I appreciate that texts like that, like this one from mayors, and podcasts like that are able to eliminate some of those places that we don't know about. We need to know what happens with more people than just our small little piece of the world. And that is, again, like, kind of like the purpose of education in many ways, is to show us that there's more out there than what we experience typically. Anyhow, so as far as like the students' responses, particularly the male response, like I was not entirely surprised, again, coming from, being a woman. I know, like, men don't think that certain things should be talked about, when you're on your period. It's kind of embarrassing to try to have your dad or your husband, not embarrassing for me necessarily, but for them to have them go out to go get, whatever you need when you're on your period. Or even when I was a teenager, being embarrassed about getting a male clerk to ring me up. Little things like that. So I could see it on their face. They were embarrassed too. They're like, oh, this is not something that I should be privy to right now, even though it's a natural function of a woman's body. And so, yeah, just being able to, read what that violent reaction, that, when I say violent, I don't mean I just mean explosive, maybe, reaction that her male students had, or their male students had. I wasn't really surprised. Because this whole ideal image that we're sold is not reality, and men are so visual in many ways that when you have that image in their mind challenged, then that does a lot to them, and kind of makes them question reality in many ways. Anyhow, so and I'm not surprised by the women either, who felt like they could relate to her, and they sympathized, and because they know, this is part of what we go through. Mayors goes through more on top of that, and so they know, like, the gravity of what she's discussing, and they feel compassion for her. And anybody who reads it would certainly feel that. I know most women do, and I imagine, of course, in graduate classes, this would also be the same for the guys, because I feel like first-year composition students are, not quite there yet. They're gonna get there, as we see at the end of the article, Becoming Visible. We see at the end of the semester that the guys really did come around, and they learned from that experience, which again is kind of what we're shooting for here, is for them to kind of grow. And I think that's great that we get to see that in a classroom, and see that a piece like Mayor's can really facilitate that. So anyhow, those are my 2-in-1 artifacts, because they kind of relate together, and I didn't want to really separate them because I read one article, or Mayor's article, based on the other one. Anyhow, let me know if you have any questions or anything, and see you in a little bit.